All right, so it is Tuesday. It's August the 2nd, 2016, and we are here in Wayne County near West Salem, and we're with Dean McIlvaine. I'm Jess Lamar Reece Holler, and this is an interview for the Ohio Ecological Food Farm and Movement Memory Project. And Dean, could I have you introduce yourself?
Hello, my name is Dean McIlvaine. I'm an organic grain and grass-fed beef farmer from West Salem, Ohio.
So just to start us off, Dean, can you tell me a little bit about where you come from?
I grew up in Wayne County, went to Worcester High School, the county seat. Grew up, my father was the John Deere dealer in town, and he invested in farmland, and I took more interest in farming than I did in the machinery business, but have always been around equipment and growing crops. I took interest in farming primarily because I saw it as one of many career choices that could have been made, but I thought it was the most valuable and most important, especially when I was introduced to the idea of organic farming, which happened while I was in college at Grinnell College in Iowa in the late 70s. There was a young lady approached me after my freshman year and asked if I wanted to participate in an on-campus house that was going to be, the theme was the Grinnell Outdoor Recreation Program. And that sounded pretty interesting. The main caveat was she was vegetarian and the house was going to be vegetarian. Well, that's okay by me. And during the course of the year, she and I were the primary shoppers for the house because I had the transportation and she knew what we were looking for. So we would drive around town and the county of Poweshiek in Iowa, sourcing natural foods and organic foods, which were not labeled in those days and were not defined in those days, except that we wanted to find food that was grown without chemicals. And it was a great experience, and it just grew with me, and I continued my interest and followed up my pursuit after college by going into the Peace Corps because it was hard to find any information at home about organic farming. Those people who were farming without chemicals were small and isolated and sparse there. So I thought going to the Peace Corps would be a way to learn about farming with less inputs. But my placement in Paraguay, South America, proved to be quite the opposite. The site where I was sent was loaded with chemicals, and they were primarily, gifts from AID, and there were more toxic chemicals there than what we would even allow in the United States. One of the first projects they gave me was to organize their chemical building, which I detested, but did it. There were rusty cans of DDT and lots of skull and crossbone items that was not, it was surprising. And I realized that these people in these third world countries had access to these horrific chemicals but did not know how to use them and knew even less about safeguarding themselves against their potential dangers. When I returned home and worked on the farm, my innate dislike for the chemical smell was really strong. It just resonated with me as not being healthy. My father, who was a busy businessman and took on a lot of responsibilities, did not safeguard himself to the chemicals and died at an early age from non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, which has been shown to be related right back to Agent Orange and its components, which included lasso and l.r.h and atrazine, which were the popular chemicals of the day for controlling weeds. My mom would relate times that Dad would come home and take a bath and the tub would be yellow with the chemical being rinsed from his body. So I was lucky that my dad gave me an opportunity to take the land he had invested in and convert it to organic production. Finding out what that involved was my endeavor for the early 80s. And I think it was in 1982 I discovered OFA and went to the first OFA conference at Capital University in Columbus and was introduced to the world of like-minded people trying to preserve health through good food that was not contaminated or tainted with chemicals. I got involved with the OFA board in the mid-'80s and just immersed myself with learning as much as I could about it. I enjoyed the learning mostly from the old-timers who had been involved in organic gardening primarily, and they were very eccentric people. Oftentimes not shy about their convictions, and had beautiful gardens that really attested to the ability of growing organically. My first real mentor was probably Jim Heminger, who I read about in a New Farm magazine in the early 80s. New Farm was a spin-off to the organic gardening publication that Rodale put out. And here was a farmer featured on the front page who was from Ohio, growing adzuki beans. So my first attempt at growing organically was a small patch of adzuki beans in the most remote part of the farm where nobody could see what I was attempting. And because it was remote, it was a unique crop. I had adzuki beans to eat for the next 5 years. But it launched my interest, and through Jim I found other markets, and that interest and mentorship really expanded when I learned about the Spray brothers, Rex and Glenn, who had farms similar in size of several hundred acres, and they seemed to be normal people who were just doing taking a unique approach. And so I tried to follow and adopt their methods as much as possible and adapt them to my farm. We had great success in the early years. I don't know if it was dumb luck or if there was residual carryover, but just as I was getting certified for the first time in 1988, growing soybeans, there was a company in Michigan who was looking for soybeans, Eden Foods. And I grew soybeans for them for the next 15 years. Along with growing soybeans and any organic system, it's good to have a crop that you can rotate, rotational crops. And soon after that, a company of Purity Foods out of Michigan, Lansing, Michigan, was looking for spelt growers. And spelt was a good crop to rotate with soybeans. And I've been growing spelt ever since then for different food processors. The other aspect of what I've focused on was growing food for people. So food grade soybeans and food grade spelt were my main business for a long time. Since in more recent years there's been an interest in growing more feed stocks for animals. Organic Valley was getting started about the same time in the late 80s, and they eventually found their market to grow into Ohio, and so I've broadened my cropping rotation to include hay and corn and a variety of other small grains for a variety of markets. Diversity has been the cornerstone of our program here, and the addition of livestock in recent years has improved it even more. OFA has been the benchmark, I guess, for making all of this possible in Ohio. They were one of the first organizations to offer an organic certification program. It was basically modeled after California and Oregon tilth. And I remember in the 80s serving on the OFA board as a representative and even as a secretary to a lot of our discussion was around standards and what would qualify for organic and how to administer that. It was all volunteer in those days, so everybody was doing the best they could. And then in the 90s, the National Organic Program was established, and everything has just taken off since then in the organic world. So much so that you can fast forward to today, and now it's a worldwide market of organic production that has taken that little niche that we held here in the early days and to a worldwide level. Good and bad both. Good that we have organics and people wanting to grow organically and are sensitive to chemicals that are used, but challenging in that the marketplace has become more competitive. But that's another topic. I will get off on a tangent and ramble. I feel like I've gone there now.
No, this is perfect. Well, I can ask you a particular question. which is, I'm interested, you mentioned, back at Grinnell was when you first kind of got turned on to organics, and this was in the early 80s or the 70s?
That would have been in 1976, the beginning, 76 to 79. I graduated in 79.
Can you remember back to what your sense of what organics meant, what the values were behind it, what that was like at Grinnell and in the social world you were a part of?
Well, it made immediate sense that, things that kill plants and insects are likely to be harmful to us. We're just bigger examples of the same organisms, basically. It was heresy at home to suggest growing anything without herbicide or without synthetic fertilizers. I remember the mill operator that we used to deal with, and he was telling me, you're going to be mining your soil and removing all of its nutrients. And it done improperly, that's true. And the worst thing we do as organic farmers that contributes to that mining process is the excess tillage that's required, or we think is required, to control weeds and prepare seed bed. And so there's been a long ongoing struggle in my own mind about the balance between the use of chemicals and the use of the plow. There were some books early on about the harms of tillage, and that is the big downfall of the organic system. One book I remember was called Plowman's Folly. I think it was written in the 40s. And another really influential book for me was One Straw Revolution by a Japanese author and researcher. And he showed that he was able to grow rice in a basic no-till situation where he would just cast seeds and harvest. And he would use a lot of cover crops of rye and vetch and radishes, the daikon radish. And it's curious, today those have become very popular cover crops all of a sudden, and and being used effectively in organic systems. I've not had that great success doing it here personally, but have chosen to add more animals to my system to help control the weeds and build the soil. And the problem with tillage is we're just destroying the organic matter and destroying the foodstuffs for the biology that unleashes the nutrients that we were accused of mining. And so instead of, killing the weeds, I've been trying to think more about building a more balanced soil that where weeds would not want to grow. And these are ideas that I learned early on or was exposed to but didn't really learn them or the full effect. Weeds are a reflection of a soil imbalance. Insect pests are a reflection of a plant that is in poor health. You beat insects by having healthy plants. You combat weeds by having a balanced soil. And the best way to balance the soil, I feel, is through the use of cover crops and cover crops that are used to feed the biology that will balance the soil. And to think on that microscopic level and how effective that can be has just been difficult. Coming from a family of fast movers and forward thinkers and adopting new technologies and wanting to make things happen sooner rather than later, it's really taken me a lifetime to slow down and reverse and get off that treadmill to think about the power of biology and the power of numbers that we don't give enough appreciation to, you know, the ability of microbiology to feed our plants and rejuvenate our soils. So the use of cover crops, and in conjunction with the new no-till organic systems, is really in its formative years right now, although being revived from one straw revolution, but in a different context here in America. And there's hope and promise that we can reach the ideal of an organic no-till system. We're not there yet. It's still a work in progress, just like the development of organic standards. But at some point I could see the use of minimizing the use of tillage could be an important component to maximizing the value of organic production. And the other aspect too is having an animal component on the farm. The Spray brothers often spoke of it, and the numbers never made sense to me. They had 800 acres, but they only had 30 or 40 head of cattle, it seemed. But it works in the diversity that the animals bring, and that it's not necessarily the numbers, but just the addition of the animal component that can inoculate the soil for different bacteria to grow and flourish, and also creates a need for a more diverse set of crops to be grown to supplement their feeding. So we don't always have to think about, it's less important to think about the quantity in organics and really focus on the quality. If you focus on the quality of what's grown, the quantity, the volume will flourish.
So I have to ask you on that note, I was surprised getting into this project how many large-scale organic grain farmers there are in Ohio, because I think that the organic movement I was trained in was really rooted in homesteading and urban farming and small-scale vegetable production. So why for you is larger scale grain farming with an animal component? Why has that been your path?
Well, first of all, we had the land. My father invested in a lot of farmland in Wayne County, and that was the resource that I was building from. And we actually cut our tillable acres in half when I took over. Dad had more land. He was the largest landowner in Wayne County in the 80s. But we let go of a lot of the marginal land and some other. Just reduced our acres to what I thought was manageable for this kind of system. And when you're growing a higher quality crop, you don't need to have as many acres to be profitable. And everybody has a different comfort level, and there's an economy of scale for the equipment available. So 800 and some acres that we farm has been, manageable and kept me in a driver's seat that I didn't feel I was wearing myself out prematurely doing everything by hand. And the demand is such that we need more production. That there is a growing consumer base that needs to be fed. So it's been natural course to see more and more big farmers get involved.
How do you feel about the potential no-till organic future that you've been describing?
It's a steep learning curve on how to make that system work, but I can see that it's doable. That by growing cover crops that will die naturally or can be easily rolled down can create a really nice mulch for a new spring seeding to take hold. And the equipment that exists today makes it doable. The benefits are good for the soil, good for the planet, good for the plant. Ground that is kept covered in mulch, whether living or crop residue, is going to be cooler, and plants can conserve and utilize moisture better if they're not taxed by excess heat. The difficulty for me in doing this kind of work in the last 3 or 4 years has been the ever-increasing extremes in our weather cycles that have made this challenging endeavor even more difficult, to the point where I've disbanded that notion for a time until I get a better base established with the livestock, working with the livestock.
Where does the pressure come from to even look into no-till? Is that something internally you're driven to because you believe in it, or from market demand?
No, it's my personal goal. There's no request for it in the marketplace. They just want it to be organic, and I just want it to be organic that's sustainable and beneficial. And after so many years of driving around in circles on the farm, it's become exhausting, like the dog chasing his tail, trying to get a handle on the weeds out there. And so I've been forced to look at alternatives that reduce that tractor time, and continuing to the pursuit of trying to mimic nature and work with nature and be less of a consumer of natural resources and more of a provider.
Is that tied to particular environmental beliefs that hold across your life?
Yes, that's been a lifelong goal. In pursuit of that, I put a solar array on the farm a couple of years ago that provides all of our electric production. We're a net producer of electricity, for example. One of those many things on the bucket list, so to speak, of things you idealize when you're young and takes a lifetime to accomplish. But even though it may not be the smartest choice economically in the short term, it sure feels good. There's a great degree of satisfaction. And so it might take a little longer to recoup the investment. Little did I know that oil prices were going to drop from over $100 to under $40 a barrel. That would prolong the payback on it. But at least I feel like I'm a part of the solution instead of a contributor to the problems that plague our environment and world and climate. And I do much better when you ask me questions. Keep me focused.
Well, looking back, I'm just curious, where do you think your environmental ethos came from, whether in the turn to organic farming or other kind of things? When did that start?
Okay, that started for me in 1973, which was the year I became legally able to drive a car. And at that same time we had a so-called energy crisis. And I remember seeing gasoline prices go from 32 cents a gallon to 59 cents a gallon. Almost overnight it seemed gas prices doubled, and lines, you could only buy gas every other day. You know, there was a rationing, and there was the 55 mile an hour speed limit, and the world was coming to an end faster than we was ever predicted, and it felt at that time. So I, being young and impressionable, learned about the finite resources that we consume, and felt I should do my part and have as small a footprint, environmental footprint as possible. Recycling has always been a natural thing for me. My grandmother grew up in the Depression and recycled everything and was very thrifty and could make anything, and those were skills that were admired by me, and it was nice to know where things came from, and especially where they contribute to my own personal health. And at in those teenage years, you also start to develop a palate for foods that you hated as a child, and taking an interest in food has driven much of my efforts, and the desire to share those things with others.
Can you tell me about that particular moment you're mentioning when you had developed an expanded palate in your teenage years?
Well, that it happened when I was in college, primarily, and we were cooking for ourselves, and I continued that through the rest of my college years, and learning about new foods. In my household, it was pretty much hamburger and French fries and a glass of milk with either peas or beans that came from a can or a frozen bag and tasted horrible. And there were a lot of foods in those days that were presented as a child that tasted horrible, but suddenly when you found them in their more natural, raw, organic state, were really delicious. And when you realize that it's not the food that's the issue, it's where it's grown is what makes it good or bad, not the fact that it's an okra or an anchovy. And I don't know, food became like the holy grail for me and good health. I saw my grandfather and father both die of cancer at an early age, and I wanted to lead a healthier, happier life. They both worked extremely hard, and were their lives were cut short because of their haste and need to be first at doing things. Well, instead I became first in going back to the old methods of farming, or among the first, I should say.
I'm curious of this sentiment and kind of reflecting on your parents' generation and maybe some of the health tolls, environmental tolls of a particular lifestyle. Was that something you shared with other classmates at Grinnell or part of the culture of the place? Or was that just you on your journey?
That was primarily me on my journey. My father's passing didn't occur until after I was out of college in 1995, but he was only 62 years old. And while I understood the connection, I didn't see it firsthand until, well, first it occurred with my first wife, got breast cancer at the age of 32 and was gone by the time she was 37. Her father also had prostate or colon cancer. My mom and mother-in-law, breast cancer. It's just been rampant in my life, or was quite rampant in the 90s, and it just solidified my conviction to following the organic model of trying to do things better. And even though my dad was a graduate of Ohio State School of Ag Business, he encouraged me not to give up on my endeavor to pursue organic farming, which I thought was quite commendable for him to allow me to follow my pursuits.
Feel free to turn this down if this is too sensitive of a question, but I'm curious, when your dad got sick, were you able to talk with him about how he had farmed and how you were farming and some of the, did he connect his own sickness to his lifestyle and career?
My dad was a man of few words, and he did, and he was a little bit hesitant to follow the organic methods. He and I would argue about how deep we should be plowing, for example, and there was a learning curve there that I was exploring different ways of doing things, and he politely stepped aside and let me do it my way. And so in the end, he did make the connection. We didn't elaborate on it a whole lot. Just it only takes one vision of watching him stir herbicide into a sprayer with his arm instead of a stick. And that one incident is all it took for me to realize that, well, there's no wonder he was overcome by it. I don't know how many times he might have done it. But that's the haste of being, farming under pressure, and to maybe cover too many acres in a timely fashion. You start to take shortcuts, and that's one that I know I've witnessed him taking, and it obviously caught up to him. And so I've just tried to be more patient and diligent in following the organic model. Many of the mentors that I had in organic world all lived long, healthy, vibrant lives. The ones that I remember most were all in their 80s and 90s and very active and enthusiastic. So I think that's a good, strong testament to its merits.
I'm curious, as an organic farmer who came from family background where your family had farmed chemically, and this was something your dad had been taught at OSU, I'm presuming.
Mm-hmm.
How, over the years, how have you related to the fact that official doctrine, mainstream practice says all this chemicals, all this stuff is okay? Do you relate to that in a particular way, or have you reconciled to that?
Yeah, it's it's okay. It's a relative term as to its degree of safety. Sure, there were lots of stories of chemical salesmen proving the safety by consuming their product. And sure, maybe it didn't kill them today, but that doesn't mean they didn't survive the long term, or what other issues might have plagued them. It's not that difficult to figure the connection out. The advent of microbiology and being able to identify organisms in the soil and quantify the numbers of organisms and realizing the benefit of what they do and how they interact with plants and it's our pursuit of high yields and high production that has caused us to give up on the quality of what we're producing. And in an ever growing population where that demand for more is never ending, we've given up, or we've sacrificed the pursuit of quality. It's many of the farmers who I know got involved in organic production did so because of some health concern. They made a personal connection between the use of chemicals and some health issue for them. A lot of livestock farmers also saw the benefits early on, where they would note animals, cows, turning their nose up at conventionally grown grain compared to the organic grain. They saw that the organic grain consumption would be relatively less. It didn't take as many bushels or pounds to be satisfied. Today, we see a lot of obesity, and it's because we're eating food that has no nutritional value, and we try to make up for its lack of value by engorging ourselves with more and more of it. Our body is craving something that our food is lacking, and people who are pursuing organic foods of higher quality are finding better health at the same time. And the explosion in the healthcare system currently has also coincided with the explosion in the interest in organic foods. There are many people who are recognizing that their ill health is related to what they've been eating. And I have a bumper sticker on the back of my truck I am so proud of. It's grow your own health care. And to me, it says it all. And the more people who can connect with that and actively involve themselves with it will find not only better health, but inner peace and groundedness, and at least a beginning to step off the treadmill of a hurried, scurried race to the end of our lives.
I have to ask you on that note, is this type of farming here at Twin Parks, is this a spiritual practice for you? Do you think of it that way, or?
Oh, at times, yes. I've gone through numerous phases in my approach to farming. I've been very, very religious at times and conducted tours complete with prayers and thanks to the God and powers that we don't see or understand. I've spent a lot of time following Peter Tolkien's Secrets of the Soil book of talking to my plants, trying to encourage them in every way possible. There's the ethereal feeling that we're all interconnected, and that the more in tune we can become with nature, the more it will flourish, and the happier we will be. So I've been through the gamut of different levels of spirituality and appreciation of how everything has an impact on everything else that happens here. And that's what I like about the animals most of all, is just what a calming presence they bring. And they set a pace here on the farm that we cannot hurry. And anytime I've attempted to hurry them along, I've injured myself. And learning to be smarter than the cow that won't stay within its boundaries, or being patient in loading the pigs on market day. That there's things you have to do that have to be in tune with nature, and that applies to the plants as well. We might want to hurry them to grow, but we have to think long term, and there's a right time for doing everything, and it's usually not dictated by a social schedule, but it's usually dictated by the sun and the rain.
This might be hard to answer, but would you say that becoming an organic farmer and having a system integrated with animals with their own pace, plants with their own pace, how has that impacted other arenas of your life in terms of who you are as a person and how you work in the world?
Well, I guess it's made me enjoy being on the farm and working with my surroundings, something that I appreciate more and more with every trip off of the farm. And while it's fun to go visit the cities or the people in town, those visits really make you appreciate the peace and quiet of the farm. It also gives me a feeling of wisdom that the people in town don't realize. How things occur, where things come from. There's an increasing awareness, but I feel like I have a unique perspective and depth of understanding. To listen to today's politicians and the solutions that they bring forth they're so slow. They're so behind where the rest of us are in terms of finding personal and national security. It comes from a population of people who are satisfied and healthy. And happiness comes from good health more than anything else. And for people who forget that, they're in for a rude surprise. you can have all the wealth in the world, but if you don't have health, your wealth is useless. Especially with today's healthcare system.
I'm wondering if you could tell me a little bit about how you take care of your own personal health, whether it's the dream or the reality, but maybe in an ideal world, what would you do? What are you able to do? I'm so
Well,
curious.
as my good friend Kathy Evans says, wheatgrass and yoga. Wheatgrass and yoga. When all else fails, those are the two primary prescribed activities that will contribute more to curing what ails you, mentally and physically, spiritually. And just a good balance of exercise and hydration. I do lament that, my children haven't picked up in my footsteps here on the farm. Maybe there's one thing on the bucket list unfulfilled yet, but there's still time. And, I allowed them, like my father allowed me, to follow their own pursuits, which have taken them to places far and wide away from the farm. And as time goes on, I wonder if there'll be a reason for me to stay on the farm without their participation. But at least I can say, in spite of whatever their activities, they've taken the organic model with them, and they are individually pursuing good health through good nutrition, and they share that mindset with the people they come in contact with. So the seeds are growing, but in different places from where I expected them to.
Now, in your own life journey, I wanted to ask you this earlier, actually. When you headed out to Grinnell and away from Wayne County, did you intend all along to come back here and be a farmer? Or did you have a different thing in mind at 18, 19?
Not at all. I went to college, with the idea of improving the world through politics, actually, and through government and regulation. And I went to Grinnell primarily to study law and go to law school, and I wanted to make change from the top, where it seemed like the power lies. But as I related, I got off track and refocused, and actually I feel I've had a bigger impact by working from the grassroots level and being a part of this great movement of organic production.
I'd love to actually hear you talk a little bit more about your early days back at the farm here. I'm particularly interested in networks of information and knowledge, and how, before the National Organic Program, before certification, all of that, how people found information, found different practices to try out, what they read, who they talked to. So after Peace Corps, coming back to Ohio, can you paint me a picture of kind of what that was like and where your channels were for becoming the farmer you are now?
Well, I remember coming home and asking my father about, are there any organic farmers that you know of? And the one name that came to mind was Gordon Barter. And he was a small farmer, big gardener, west of Worcester. And I think he was also maybe a school teacher. And when I went and visited him, he was elderly at that time and had a garden. It was very prolific, the most beautiful garden I'd seen. And he just had a real strong passion for organic gardening. And that didn't really relate. I mean, it didn't equate to what I wanted to do, but at least it was something. And from there, I think I ran across an ad in the Ohio Farmer one time about the OFA conference that was coming up, the Ohio Ecological Food and Farm Association. It wasn't very big, it didn't say much about it, just the dates in Columbus in February and Capital University, and I just showed up, and following that one little ad I found. And then I think Gordon, Mr. Barter, introduced me to the New Farm publication, which was relatively new at that time, and then Jim Hemminger's, the connection I had there, and the visit and friendship that followed. So it was just the fluke chance of picking up on a seed that was planted by some others, and keeping it alive and growing from that.
Do you remember, like, at the early OFA conferences you attended, what were some of the big issues or things people were trying to make happen?
In the early days, the big issue was combating the land-grant colleges and the misinformation that was coming from their production-oriented systems, and how the research of the day was all wrong, and that they were just promoting high yields with poor quality and paying no attention to organic methods, and how it was all chemical driven with disregard for the biological component. And there were a number of speakers who were just real radical, rabble-rousing. Tom Harding from Pennsylvania, Charles Schweibel, some of these old guys who really got your dander up and were almost like fire and brimstone preachers about the ills of the land-grant colleges, and how they were leading, how our government and these government institutions were leading us down a path of demise and self-destruction and poor health. And it was all for the benefit of a big chemical company who still persists today. Fortunately, there were enough free-thinking people who went to small liberal arts schools instead of the land-grant universities, and recognized, like the canary in the coal mine, that things are not what they seem, and we want to make them better. We heeded the warnings of ill health or sick family members, or just our own innate senses telling us this isn't right. But it was difficult to find like-minded people. It was a challenge to find information about how to do it differently, or safely, sustainably, organically. And luckily I had some good successes early on because it gave me confidence that I was on the right path. Now granted, we've had some setbacks along the way that have rattled my beliefs to their foundation, but you weather the storm and go forward with your follow your heart sometimes is more important than following your mind, and stay the course. But yeah, organic farming is not easy. It's not without its challenges, and the worst challenges have a chemical solution that makes it seem pretty simple. But in the long run, we've seen they only mask problems that come back and bite us in worse ways.
Can you say more about those setbacks? It seems like you're describing some moments where
The weeds have taken over, and we have just another catastrophic season of too much weed pressure. And most of those thoughts have been perceived more than real. In a chemical world, you see pristine fields with perfect monoculture and not a weed in sight. In an organic system, you can have, and we have had, great crops, but they'll be peppered with weeds. And sometimes they look like they're overtaken by weeds that appear worse than they really are. So it becomes a perception of what's good and what's bad. And then there have been years that the weeds did take over and caused a loss or near total loss in production on certain fields. So it's not been, a home run every year. It's been hitting a lot of having small successes peppered with some ever renewing challenges. We've seen weed pressure change from one pest to another. As we work to correct one problem in the soil, there'll be a different issue spring up. In our attempt to find that perfectly balanced soil. And it's a very complex system. Like Gary Zimmer said, it's not rocket science. It's much more complicated than that. The interactions between plants and that three-legged stool of chemistry and biology and physical structure and how to balance that.
So I have to ask you, either now or in those early days when you first started going to OFA, found your mentors, how have you been received trying to do this in Wayne County? Is this the norm?
Well, I was the odd man out in the early days. I wasn't the first organic farmer in Wayne County, but I might have been the first one certified in Wayne County. And my co-workers or neighbors, I was known as the chicken shit farmer because I went to a local layer house and I hauled truckloads of chicken manure in and piled them up around the farm to put on the fields, and created a stinky mess for a time, waiting to get that applied. And of course then there were the weeds that would follow, and the shotgun approach that I took was largely taking things I'd learned from great producers like the Spray Brothers and applying portions of what I learned to my operation that still yielded marginal results. And it wasn't until you get the whole system adopted. You can't just pick and choose what the great people have done and expect the same success. You can't just drink part of the Kool-Aid. You have to consume the whole cup to get the full effect and get your soils balanced and production up and pests minimized. And really the notion of pests is largely in the eye of the beholder. to see a few weeds or to see a few insects is not the end of the world. And sometimes those are strays or just momentary flukes. And it does not create a reason to pull out and abandon the organic pursuit.
Can you say more about your system? So I was really intrigued by you're saying that a partial shotgun approach didn't cut it until everything got locked into place. And earlier you had said that the animals are a critical part of that, the system working. So how would you describe that? Is it ever stable, or is it always changing?
It's forever changing. And it, our climate is changing. You can't just, do things like a recipe cookbook approach. You're working with a living organism that is forever adapting. We, as stewards of the land, have to adapt with them. Sometimes we do things for one purpose, and something dictates the weather or whatever that we have to go a different course. But being flexible and adapting is important. And so being in tune with what's going on in the soil and with your animals' health is critical to their success. And I don't foresee that changing too much, to varying degrees. It's also been helpful to try not to change everything at once. I mean, there's a lot of different components to piece together, and it's wise not to try and fix everything at once, because invariably you're going to get mixed results that don't tell you the real causes as to why things happen the way they did. But it takes, ongoing observation throughout the growing season, and even outside of the growing season, as to what's going on in the soil. And the advent of mob grazing, the cattle that we've introduced to the farm on a large scale has served a number of issues, not only just with the diversity of the crops, but also in the way in which we manage them, that they are now a part of my rotational system, that we have corn followed by soybeans, followed by small grains, followed by clover, followed by cows, and then back to corn again. Has broadened the diversity, has expanded our marketing offerings, and has enhanced the diversity of the farm. It's also lightened the workload. Instead of having a big crop harvested at once, we have a variety of crops harvested over a larger window. And instead of hauling manure to the fields, we just have a animal delivery system already done. Check. And that lends itself to the idea of reducing our footprint in the fossil fuel consumption, and gets me one step closer to just planting and harvesting.
Speaking of labor, I had wanted to ask you earlier, and we chatted a bit about this before we turned it on, but tell me about who has worked here and been a part of the farm since you started.
Well, in the early days, I would have there'd be 5 or 6 people working, and a fleet of tractors, and lots of concentrated effort at planting time, and again at harvest, fall planting. But over time, with the diversity of crops, we've changed our concentration of planting time, and the advent of bigger equipment that's more efficient, more comfortable, and has enabled me to reduce that seasonal help down to just me and one full-time guy who where we're able to get things done pretty easily. So it's a combination of things. Hiring the cows to take care of a couple hundred acres has been the biggest improvement. And even on days that I might feel lazy, they're still out there grazing, doing their job of harvesting the plants and weeding and spreading the manure.
Do you like cows?
I have learned to love cows, yes.
What is your relationship with them been like since they've been here?
You love them when they're grazing when they're supposed to. You hate them when they get out. And just learning, patience, taking time for them instead of asking them to work in your time frame constraints. Yes, it's a great way to reconnect with the land on a daily basis. When I was just grain farming, you would just be out there occasionally checking the soil in the spring or fall, and now with the cows you're out there daily, noting different things at different times. And
it's interesting. I was actually just wanting to ask you a few moments ago what kind of practices you kept up, if any, to stay observant to the changes in the land, the things you needed to respond to. And it seems like the cattle are part of that system.
Yes. Anything that gets you out of the pickup or off the tractor and, feet on the soil is going to be helpful. I mean, there's, pasture walks, there's, crop scouting, there's things to do all the time, whether, or hand weeding, anything that gets you, feet on the ground and hands in the dirt is helpful to understanding the organic system better.
And that's not just symbolically like, well, I'm touching the dirt, so
No. I mean, it does work on a symbolic level and a subconscious level that we don't realize. And this notion of being grounded is overlooked way too much. But it's critical, whether it's for our minds or our physical body. We have a connection to the earth that, as humans, we've tried to distance ourselves. We've built these houses, we've gotten our beds up off of the cave floor, and now we have an environment that's controlled with air conditioning and heating, and we've continue to insulate ourselves from our environment. And then we ingest foods that are synthetically derived. We're even less connected. And then we have all these heady issues of whether it's depression or anxiety or whatever. And it's all because of our lack of groundedness. And that desire for groundedness is evident by things as simple as people's love for parks and walking and visiting of national parks. There's a resurgence in interest there. And it's not by accident. It's a very healthy thing that we crave, whether we know it or not. And, resurgence in the interest in home gardening, or even just people who plant flowers, any of that the act of, mowing a lawn is something that I used to scoff at how, what a horrible waste of time and energy. But for some people, their little postage stamp yard is their whole connection to the out of doors. And while they might complain about the pollen or the dust, it does give them some connection. And maybe it will open up some thought that will further improve their own personal health, or clear their minds instead of using drugs or some other artificial remedy. Two, one.
All right, we're back with Dean McIlvaine. So we were just chatting during our pause, and you were saying that you'd be interested in speaking more, or thought I'd be asking more about kind of the inner workings of OFA during the early days. So I was just wanted to open it up for you to talk to me a little bit more about how you were involved from that first conference on, and what kind of things were happening at OFA.
Yes, well, I think of history about, the formative years, who planted the first seed, how did the first group get together. And I came in on the wave of those that initiated OFA. And my perception in those days was sort of a small ragtag band of old and young and hippie and conservative individuals who just all rallied around this common interest of growing food without chemicals. And so just learning how to fit into that group initially was, and identifying who the different characters were. I mean, half would be gardeners, and another half would be consumers, and then there'd be a handful of shop owners, and then there'd be the one or two big farmers like myself. So I really felt like an outsider, coming from a large conventional farm, and trying to fit into this ragtag group of consumers and gardeners, and how to get that system to apply on my scale. Even though I found the source of the knowledge, how to expand upon it, and it's still an ongoing process. But back then everything was it was pretty anecdotal, and there was as much attention put on the critique of the current system, much more so than we see today. Back then it was debunking the problems, or debunking the system that's created the problems. And there was really far less knowledge about how to address production concerns. And it was not scientific by any means. And it was really just a lot of early slideshows of people showing what they had done, and speaking of it in terms of the theory behind it. It just makes sense that we're sick because of these bad foods. But The organization of OFA was all volunteer. To put your hand up to serve on the board was kind of like, for me, taking my head out of the sand and sticking it up into the firing squad, so to speak, with exposure. But that's the beauty of youth. You're not afraid of taking on those challenges, and I wanted to learn it, so I volunteered best I could. And fortunately, there was a lot of other people who were willing to do the same, because no one person could do it themselves. The outreach and organization of OFA has been quite remarkable.
What were some of the things you guys got up to on the board during the years you were involved, in terms of new efforts, campaigns, things OFA was trying to accomplish or create in Ohio?
Well, there was always the issue of membership, trying to how do you attract more people, and the idea was to get numbers up high enough so that you could afford to do some of the administrative tasks of running an organization. The newsletter was always huge, really important. Finding stories and getting people to contribute to spread the word. Farm tours were big, and maybe then the strong suit of OFA throughout all of its years are finding people or getting people to open their doors to invite others to come in and see how you're doing things. It's a great way to learn and share what's working and what's not working. And then, of course, certification, legitimizing the ideals and putting them into a finite set of rules that were cut and dried. And the gray area, the products that are maybe they're not the perfect, but they're not the worst, and drawing the line there between what's restricted and what's acceptable, and what you should never use. And then creating a system of certification. That was probably the biggest energy consumer, was someone to handle the paperwork and do the follow-up. And fortunately, the numbers, things grew, and it was all rather self-supporting. Mostly due to the great efforts of a lot of people who volunteered a tremendous amount of time and energy.
What were some of the particular things you worked on during your involvement?
Mostly, there was committee work. I was involved in the certification committee and OFA administration, the board. I served on the board for a number of years. Maybe more of my certification efforts took place in the late 80s. It grew out of the board participation and then expanded when the OCIA got established, the Organic Crop Improvement Association. And at that time, that expanded my contacts to national interests, and I spent more time working at that level than with OFA than in the 90s.
Can you say more about that relationship? Because I know a lot of bigger grain farmers have kind of mentioned the twin OFA-OCIA relationship and then a split, depending on what was happening internationally with organic grain markets.
Yes. At that time, OFA was not recognized nationally or internationally, And I think it was probably in about 1988 that OCIA was getting started. And if you wanted to market anything very far from home or out of state, you needed to get certified by somebody who had more international or national recognition. And OCIA offered that at the time. And so many of us, OFA didn't want to feel belittled by OCIA, so we started a chapter that overlapped. After time, it seemed a little redundant to be involved in both. There was a group in OCIA who didn't want anything to do with OFA. It wasn't that big a deal. I mean, it was for some people. There was more OCIA interest by the grain farmers, and many of them just didn't feel a connection to OFA. So they started a second OCIA chapter in Ohio exclusively for their interests, whereas the rest of us stayed with OFA and did the dual certification for a number of years. OCIA ended up having their own political issues. Don't need to get into them here. And then over time, when the National Organic Program came into being, then any organization, any certifying group that abided by the national standards got NOP recognition. So then having an OFA certification allowed you to market anywhere on equal footing with anybody else, except if you want to go overseas, in which there are certain countries have a couple little nuances to their standards, like the use of Chilean nitrate or animal manures or whatnot. But those markets have sort of come and gone. It's such a moving target, keeping up with certification and marketing and all of it. I've just been with OFA in recent years, and most of my marketing has gone from international to much more local. And as the local demand is much higher than it used to be.
Can you tell me about that actually? You're changing markets over the years, and in particular, the fluctuation of local demand for your products.
Right. Yes, back in the 90s, there were no local buyers of organic grains of any volume. We shipped soybeans to Michigan and abroad. The Japanese were a huge buyer of organic beans, and our small grains, our spelt, went to Texas to bigger national organic foods processors. It's just been with the recent boom in Organic Valley and the local dairy industry that has brought local demand for grains into Ohio. That, coupled with the poultry and interest in eggs and organic chicken, has created a big demand for organic grains in Ohio, to the point now where there's a huge amount imported, which has wreaked havoc with our markets of late. But it's just part of the storm that you have to adapt to. And so it's, like any democratic, capitalistic endeavor. It's ever changing and all, for good or bad. there when we had the last energy crisis in '08, when the energy prices soared, the big push for local became the more important than anything else, it seemed. And that was really good for our markets. But prices got so high in recent years that it encouraged a flood of imports, and then energy prices have dropped, so it's not an issue about local production anymore. But it should be, because it is part of that bigger environmental footprint that we as organic producers are trying to minimize.
On that note, I'm curious if you've seen the rise of or changes in like a larger local food system, food, environment, health connection in Wayne County since you started this. I know early on you said you were kind of one of a couple of people trying this, but now in 2016, has the landscape for just understanding changed?
Mm-hmm. It's changed a lot. It has become much more commonplace to find local organic growers, and there's whole businesses established that are focused on that. Local Roots in Worcester has been a great pioneer in that area. And it's encouraged another flood of people to become producers, and it's helped a lot of people find an outlet for their desire to be better grounded and improve their own health. Kind of creating a whole new industry. There was a time when I proclaimed organic agriculture was the cure for any of society's ills. That there wasn't an issue in society that could not be improved or addressed through the promotion of organic agriculture, whether it's high unemployment or increasing healthcare costs or mental health or prison overcrowding. I saw involvement of people in organic agriculture as being a benefit.
How do you feel now?
Oh, that's still true. Unquestionably. We need to get more people involved with their own health instead of expecting to find it in a healthcare program that just perpetuates past sins and exacerbates chemical usage. Getting back to the root causes of problems, whether it's idleness among youth that needs something to do, or if it's obesity among people who need an activity that's healthy and wholesome, or even just learning to interact with our neighbors on a local basis by frequenting their offerings at the roadside.
I'm curious on that note, have you been a part of education or outreach in organic farming in any particular way at Twin Parks? Through farm tours, through other means?
Just indirectly, through the OFA Farm Tour program, or I used to be invited to speak to classes or write articles in papers, but I haven't pursued that as my primary endeavor. Just living by example here.
Speaking of that too, one thing I've been really interested to ask many of the people I've been able to interview is interested in the connection between what you're doing on the farm and how you've eaten or changed how you eat over the years? Have there been things that have happened in your life connected to farming or not that have made you change how you eat personally?
Well, not a whole lot. I mean, fortunately for me, I was introduced to the food aspect first, and the farming followed that pursuit. So from a very early age or early time in organics, I was the only one I knew of at the time who came at it from that angle. That I was sourcing and buying organic foods before it was labeled organic, and that was a big issue in the early days of where do you find things. But since I was a farmer and I was connected with organic production, I was able to source things from an early age, from an early time. And some of that has expanded. Yes, my palate has expanded to including a lot of different weeds that might be grown that I've discovered that really taste pretty good, and had that reinforced by different speakers, dandelions, lamb's quarters, clover, and having cows. It's fun to sample. Well, why are they eating this one, or why are they not eating this one? And I'm not afraid to sample it too. And sometimes it's pretty bitter, and sometimes it's surprisingly sweet. And even the bitter things I often think of as just not good medicine. If the cows are eating it for some reason, they're not dumb as to what they need, and they have free choice. So we need to explore and, I think, be more open in our own consumption and not be afraid of trying things. And that's the beauty of today's culinary world, is everything's open to trial, and there's a lot of great discoveries and things we can learn from other cultures, and it all makes sense the more we study it and look back at history to what has worked and why we've decided to recreate everything in recent generations is usually just for some personal political gain or economic profit ahead of health. Oh, I wanted to share a college connection that I had in the form of a classmate named Jim Garst. And his father, whose first name escapes me right now, worked with Pioneer, I believe, in the early days of hybrid corn development in the 40s and 50s. And the story I remember or read was Pioneer would give a farmer the seed corn to plant. If they planted their corn, the only payment they expected or needed back was to split the profit on those bushels increased. And at that time, when corn was only yielding 30 bushel, to plant these hybrids and get 60 bushel was a huge increase. And Pioneer did quite well with that method of getting people to try them and showing them the results. And the hybrid corn business flourished. And then there was an additional component of fertilizer added that took that average of 60 bushel corn in the early 40s to 120 bushel by the 50s or early 60s. And Mr. Garst was a close friend and politically involved with Nikita Khrushchev, the ruler, dictator of Russia during the 50s. And Mr. Garst theorized that hungry people, war. And that if you could feed the world, there would be more peace. And Khrushchev, who had a large country that was poor and, appreciated the value of what Mr. Garst had done. And when he came to this country to visit, he made a special request to visit the Garst family. And my classmate, Jim, recently showed on a Facebook page the old 8mm footage of his father and grandfather visiting with Nikita Khrushchev. And that theory still rules today. I mean, we give a lot of aid to a lot of countries with the benefit, of hope of keeping peace. It's just the distribution. There's no lack of food in the world. It's just a lack of good distribution. Unfortunately, the people who are handling it tend to corner it and use it in their local countries as a political tool. And so as a Peace Corps volunteer, our goal was, teach someone to grow it themselves and they'll be fed for life instead of just giving them a handout where they're only fed for a day or a year. So there are both short-term and long-term goals through all of our efforts. And I like to think that the organic food movement has been a long-term goal with a lot of short-term benefits along the way.
And this might sound trite, but how do you feel about, I've heard from conventional farmers in my family, they say organics won't work, it won't feed the world, and what we're trying to do is feed the world. But as a large farmer who's making a go of it with organics and has for a while, how do you feel about that idea? Especially as someone who was in the Peace Corps kind of working on these issues as a part of your life.
Yes, it is an issue that on blind faith I would like to say, of course we can feed the world. But when you look at all of these other issues, distribution and preservation, and it's in my small perspective, I'm just saying that on blind faith more than any scientific knowledge. And that maybe I'm sticking my foot in my mouth a little bit here, but there are a lot of people in this world. And it, I believe, can happen in the long run, but to go cold turkey worldwide on banning chemical usage and expecting, optimum production and feeding the world, there would be a severe learning curve. There'd be a severe loss, setback. And I don't have current statistics on how much of our food goes into industrial uses, corn, beans. So we don't need as many bushels as we think we do if we focused all of it into food rather than industry. But on the other hand, the grains that are substituted or used in industry are offsetting the use of petrochemicals in a lot of cases. So it's not without merit. I guess what I would suggest is let the chemically produced grains go for industrial uses to keep the peace in the short term, and just focus all food production on organic production. And in that regard, I don't think there's any question organics can feed the world.
I wanted to ask you a question which might sound silly, but I've tried to ask a number of people this, which is looking back on your own history in the organic food and farm movement in Ohio and your own involvement, what do you think that new farmers just coming to organics need to know about your generation and you guys, what you guys did in the late 70s and 80s to get us where we are today?
Well, the biggest thing is to be fearless and open-minded, and trying new things, and just give it a fair shot, give it a fair chance. The problem now is that everything has become so expensive, from land to equipment to labor, and it's much riskier. It feels like it's much riskier to try something new because there's too much at stake. But quite honestly, those risks were the same for us. And we had 18% interest rates on top of the land mortgage. So it really just takes a blind faith at some point, if and follow the example of the neighbor who's doing it successfully, and start small. Keep it your risk manageable, and don't be discouraged by minor setbacks. Even major setbacks can be major learning, opportunity for major learning. And it is a long-term, it's a long-term goal. Although I got into it without a market. I was going organic before there was a demand for organic, before there was a market for it. Just going ahead with the understanding that was the best thing to do. Fortunately, the markets followed and kept me in the business. So I guess follow your heart and be open-minded.
Thank you. I think I'll give you one last question before I open it up, which is just that you mentioned earlier that your children have taken organics to heart but aren't necessarily working on the farm or have expressed an interest in doing that. I'm curious what you're thinking in terms of your future here and the future of this family farm.
Well, since I brought in the cattle and lessened my workload, I'm going to be able to tread water a little bit longer here and not feel discouraged. There are some things on the horizon that are looking promising for us. I'm not ready to announce anything today, but there's still hope. And my kids, are rooting for me all the way, and I realize that even though they're not physically here helping or preparing to follow in my footsteps, it does give them a great sense of pride and peace and security in their endeavors. And of all the things I've tried to theorize, what else would I do? I haven't come up with anything better yet. So we're just going to hang in there and keep plugging away and hope that the current market situation will turn itself around and our local grains will be priced according to their superior quality over the imports that are now flooding and degrading our markets. It's a particularly tough time for grain farmers right now. The livestock people are doing well, the dairies and the poultry, but the influx of imported grains is unprecedented.
So when you say things are still hopeful, you mean that from a context of things being pretty tough right now?
Yeah. For most of 30 years, our organic grain prices have continually increased or plateaued before increasing. But in the last 12 months, they hit an all-time high and have fallen like off of a cliff by 30%. And at the same time that they're falling, the demand seems to have fallen off as well due to a flood of imports.
Now, if a consumer is listening to this, at an exhibit or at a farmer's market, are there things that consumers who care can do to help organic grain farmers, or is it not happening at the level of consumer choice?
Right. The buy local, buy U.S. grown. And there are some people who are talking about having a U.S. grown label to go along with the organic label and the non-GMO label, but a label that also reflects where it came from. And in most cases, there is a big break between what's grown in this country versus what's grown in third world or second world countries.
This might be a risky question, but I'm curious for the grain farmers what you think about efforts like, I don't know if you know about Shagbark Mill down in Athens or places that are trying to...
They came here before they got started.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody's been here before they got started.
Do you think those sorts of infrastructural hubs and pieces might help with or impact what grain farmers are doing in this part of the state? More mills?
They're contributing to the solution. Sure. Yeah. I don't know what their numbers are yet, but they're a step in the right direction.
What would you like to see in terms of your markets 10 years down the line that would be sustainable for you and feel environmentally just, all of that?
Well, from my goal, which stemmed back to studying economics in college, was to have a vertically integrated business where the raw ingredients were grown and processed and a finished product sold by adding value to whatever's grown. I've made some attempts at that over the years, but stumbled for whatever reason to satisfy that goal. Markets have changed faster than I jumped in, and that's probably been the biggest thing, is just limited resources on my part to fully capitalize on all the opportunities that have passed by. So I guess I forever look for that niche market that is healthy and sustainable and suitable to my farm. We've had, this has been a good place for growing things. We've had adequate rainfall most years. But then we have a drought year like this, and we're back to the drawing board and reevaluating. But so, I guess pursuit of adding value and finding that niche market.
So what keeps you doing this now in 2016 versus when you came to it fresh from Peace Corps with a lot of ideas from college and those recent experiences?
I guess the the pursuit of that perfect farm organic production. It's still in search of the holy grail of optimum production and really just a lack of a better alternative. I've had successes across the farm in bits and pieces, but to be able to replicate those successes on all acres every year, just finding that consistent crop that is maximum production and highest quality. Yeah, it's like pursuit of the Holy Grail.
Seems like it's never not interesting.
Right, and there's always something new to try. There's different scientists or people coming up with different ways of doing things and new products to try, and it's become more and more of those things that we'll never tire of trying until our body says enough is enough.
Is there anything you haven't gotten to speak to that you'd be interested in adding? That you haven't gotten to say?
What do I want to add?
Yeah.
I think you have drugged me all across the countryside and memories bank that I don't know what I didn't want to, or I can't say what Are we recording?
We are. I'm just checking something. It's being a little funky, but you're good.
The pursuit of adding value was a big one for a long time, and that was suggested. In order to grow the markets, we needed to have a strong buyer. I have been that buyer in the spelt world for a long time, but markets, things continue to change, and as soon as there's a new supply somewhere, everything is always constantly in flux. I used to think that there was a lot of loyalty in organics, faith, trust, loyalty. I mean, that's what the industry was founded on. But in recent years, with big business getting involved and buying up organic processors, that loyalty is out the door. It's gone. And I guess that leaves me a little bit in the lurch as to, well, how much longer do I want to ride this train? If I feel, I guess in some ways I feel like the industry is turning their back on me, who was here from the beginning, and now they're going to a cheaper supplier, some foreign land. So I either have to adjust and get smarter, which is what I'm doing, or pass the baton to someone else. But right now, I don't see anybody who's willing to carry on the work that I've done here on this property. And there's no guarantee of this remaining an organic farm, which would be a severe loss. I think both, personally and also, regionally. But I'm not going to stand in the way of progress if somebody else has a better idea. Nobody stood in my way, so I'm not going to stand in their way.
Is there anything else you'd like to share?
Time for a good organic grass-fed hamburger.
Well, thank you so much. Once again, we've been talking with Dean McIlvaine. We're here at Twin Parks Farm in Wayne County, Ohio, outside of West Salem. I'm Jess Lamar Reece Holler, and this is for the Ohio Ecological Farm and Movement Memory Project on August 2nd, 2016. And I just thought of something very obvious, but why Twin Parks?
Twin Parks is the reflection of our location along Interstate 71. We surround two rest areas that have been here since the interstate was built in the early 60s. And the previous owners were developers from Cleveland who were going to put together a Twin Parks development. By the 70s, they disbanded that idea. One of the brothers passed away. They put the farm up for auction. My father was high bidder, and in 1975 went out on a limb just before interest rates soared and purchased the property. And we've maintained the name because of its uniqueness. And my mom is a twin. And it confuses a lot of people. It's more often referred to as Twin Peaks Farm because of some silly TV show that was quite popular in the 90s. But we remain steadfastly Twin Parks Organic Farm.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dean.
Thank you.